Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, everyone.
Good.
Yeah, so sorry, give me a bit. Okay, yeah, so basically, last class, if I remember clearly, right? Yeah, so last class we touched a little bit on ORMs, on what else? On sessions, and then we decided that okay, I was gonna like write a project and take you guys through the topics we've discussed in like the last 3 weeks, so it will be easier for us all to understand. So I wrote this simple project, this simple web app to explain the concept or the topics we've been discussing in the last 3 weeks. So please, I want you guys like talk once in a while so I can be sure you guys can hear me. Okay.
I can hear you. I can hear you. I can hear you.
Isaac Clinton.
I can hear you.
Okay. Clinton, I'm waiting for your response, please. Okay. So we're just gonna wait. I said we were just gonna continue with that apparently. So I'll be sharing my screen now. I'll be sharing my screen now to show you guys a few things. So to recap, in the last 3 weeks, we've talked about Flask generally. We've introduced ourselves to Flask. We've talked about the templating engine. We've talked about that's Ginger 2. Talked about the WSGI engine that helps us to communicate with the server over HTTP protocols. We've also talked about databases. Sorry, we've talked about forms. I want to follow the order at which we went. So we talked about forms, web forms, and how we can create web forms using our Flask, using Flask WTF. We've talked about databases, the difference between relational and non-relational databases. Um, we've also seen ORMs. I said a few things about ORMs last week. Object relational mappers, object relational models, however you want, how it abstracts the idea of writing raw SQL away from us and just helps us to write queries using Python syntax, basically. Then we also talked about sessions. We just said a few things about sessions. We're not able to like go really deep into it. Yeah, then securing applications like authentication and all that. So basically the plan for this week was supposed to talk about building scalable applications using Flask blueprints. And I think Paul will be talking to us more about that as the class goes on. But for now what we'll be doing is I wrote a simple project just about a few lines of code that basically just explains the topics we've dealt with in the past 3 weeks. So I'll just be taking us through that now for us to see and just to see how it works, like the code we've written and then the end result basically. And I'll also highlight the topics we discussed, like where each topic was implemented basically. So I would be sharing my screen now. If you can't hear me or if you can't see anything, please just unmute your mic and let me know. So uh can you guys see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. So simply I'll just this is the Flask application, a simple Flask application. All this application does is just to for a user to go to the home page, the index page, then register your account. Once you're done registering, you log in. Once you log in, it simply just tells you welcome. So when you go to the index page, all you see is welcome stranger. But after registration and logging in, then the message you get is more specific to the user. So basically, if I log in as Damilare, it tells me welcome Damilare. If I log in as Clinton, it tells me welcome Clinton. If I log in as Paul, it tells me welcome Paul. It's just a really simple application. But at the same time, we are in this simple application, we are addressing a number of things, authentication, routing, database management, or well, basic database management, the idea of ORMs, web forms, and templating, things like that, basically. So I think to get started, I would explain what each line does, then we'll see it in action actually. So basically these first 5 lines is like we already know, since we're already familiar with Python. Basically, we're just importing all the dependencies that our application would need. So these first 5 lines are just the dependencies that we'll be making use of in the whole application. And so we'll be using Flask when these templates for things like that. Yeah, we didn't really talk much about security last week, so I'll be saying a little bit about it today. So there's this module, or should I say, yeah, module library that ships with Flask. I can't pronounce this thing, sure. But then basically it has a library submodule under it for security, basically. And that's what we'll be using to generate, because one thing we should know as developers is we can't save passwords in plain text. Because if someone gains access to your DB, or for some reason whatsoever they can see your password, if they see it in plain text, then you've basically the system is no longer secure. So basically what we want to do is ensure that our passwords are hashed. So hash a password is basically to like just put some layer of security to cover it. Let's just make it as easy as possible. The definition, sorry. Let us make the definition as easy as possible. So basically we're hashing the password. We're based on a particular key, based on, there are different levels of hashing basically, but then based on some criteria, we're trying to make a password in such a way that it's not understandable upon first glance, though there are some there are levels to web security, but then yeah, we're just using the basic hashing function that ships with Flask. So basically then we know our forms will be okay. So this, I created the forms in a new file here, a form for registration and for logging in, so we'll get to that. Then Flask Sql Alchemy, if we remember correctly, I mentioned Sql Alchemy last week. Sql Alchemy is an ORM that was designed or developed specifically for Python, basically. Then Flask Sql Alchemy is just building Sql Alchemy to support Flask. So like build an extension for Flask. So basically this is the ORM we're using. We're making use of SQL. It's called Sql Alchemy. It's what helps us abstract the raw SQL away. Basically what we do is we write raw Python code, and this Sql Alchemy converts that Python code into raw SQL queries and helps us create a database basically. Then this Bootstrap, basically all it does is to help us beautify our web page. When we get to the templates, that's the HTML files. When we get there, would see Bootstrap in action. So that's basically so for this main app, these are all the dependencies we're using. As we keep building, we'll definitely make use of more dependencies. But then for this simple app I created here, these are the major things we need basically. So like we know, to start any Flask app, what you need to do first is to instantiate your application based on, so this name here is basically the name of the file main. So it's what we are saying is this Flask app is an app based on this particular file. So this is instantiating the Flask app basically. So now we have our app that is based on, or like I said, on this file, this particular file itself. So we have to add some basic configurations. The number one configuration I feel we should add is a secret key. So a secret key is like it says a secret key, like a password or some sort, or a key that helps you recognize the whole application as is. So when we know this secret key is like the how will I put it now? Let's say the key to open the door to the application on some level. Let's just put it that way let's just make things easy for ourselves. So basically, don't use this. You are supposed to, one thing we should do, okay, I think I should just do that now, is we should cultivate the habit of putting our sensitive information in a .env file. So a .env file is like an environmental file where we keep sensitive informations, and this is hidden. If I went to this folder now, for instance, or this directory, we wouldn't. I doubt if we'd see it there. Let me. Okay, no, we've not opened this. So every other document, or every other file, every other directory that we can find here is available here. But then the .env file isn't. Why? Because .env file is hidden. So basically, that's a way of keeping our sensitive information from every other person. So if someone goes through the code base, for instance, they wouldn't know what we need, what our secret key is. Usually, this is where we keep, say, even once when we get things like sending emails, you'd have to like put your email address and your password and things like that. When you're trying to connect to a server, let's say we're connecting to like MongoDB, for instance, we wouldn't want to put the sensitive credentials for our Mongo to like an online instance of some tool or application we're making use of. We would not like to put our sensitive information here in the code. So would usually put it in a .env file in the environmental variables, basically. So if we wanted to do something like this for this secret key, we can easily just come here and say secret key equals then whatever secret key we want to use. It's usually just a group of random numbers or alphanumeric values, basically. So we have our secret key here now. So we can then come here, say the easiest way to do it. I'll usually use config or .env, but then I'll have to go and install that using pip. So to just make it easy, we can just do import OS. Then easily, instead of using this, or let's the get or so basically what this does is it goes into the like I explained earlier, this .env is like the environmental like it's how do I put it? I don't want to say the environment. These are environmental variables, basically. So it's like the environment for our software development, basically for our web app development. So this goes into the environment and gets a key. So basically, let's just load this as a key value pair. Basically, we are declaring a variable. This is the variable and this is the value. But to make us understand how it works here, let's just say this is a key and this is the value. So it gets the value based on this key we pass here. So it goes into this environment.env file and gets secret key. So usually when we do this, our secret key would actually point to this right here. As simple as that, basically. So now we have, sorry, sheesh, what did I just do? Oh, my bad. So yeah, we have our secret key here. So this here is to tell our application where or what database we'll be using. So we're simply using Sqlite. I'm sure we are familiar with Sqlite. So I want to make sure this is okay, good. So I'm sure we are familiar with SQLite. It's just like a very simple version of a very simple relational database that we can use that doesn't necessarily require. I mean, it requires its own engines, but it's not like it's not as big as them Postgres, MySQL, and all that. So it's like a easy to use database for like testing, or if you are building like a very small application that wouldn't really that you won't be doing a lot with your database. Probably just add to the database and then fetch data from the database. Basically, SQLite's like something you could use. So this line here is to connect to our database. We're telling our application, like we're configuring our application to say, okay, this is our database URI and points to this particular file. And then you can see here, I had to run a few things, but I think I'm just going to delete this so we can see. We'll get to that. Let me delete it. Basically, so what we did here is just now that we're pointing to our database. This is also something to be sincere, I actually don't know what this does exactly. But then when I ran the code, or usually when I run code, it tells me, it brings this what's it called? This flag. It tells me that I should set this to either true or false. So I just set it false. So basically, now that we're done with this, we have to instantiate our app based on the tools or on the functions and features that we'll be using. So for our database, we'll be using SQL Alchemy, like I mentioned earlier. Instead of having to like connect the database and then writing raw SQL, we'll be using the ORM SQL Alchemy. Then we'd also be using Bootstrap for we define our web pages. So that's what these two lines here are doing. So now I did not mention this last week, but then usually when you are working with a database and you're working with SQL, what you usually do is to just like do create a table, create the database first, writing raw SQL, then create the table, then start adding data to the database. But then we don't have to stress about that. Seeing we've applied, or how will I do it? We've created a variable that points to SQL Alchemy called DB. This DB gives us a feature called model where we can create a model. A model also can be seen as a table. So basically we can create a table, a simple table called users, or actually we can do this. Sorry, okay. Can do this, but then I don't feel like this is something you should stress about. Once you name your class, basically we are very familiar with classes. So this here is we are creating our table and we are creating the fields that would be in our table. So basically this is an ID field or an ID column basically that tells the table that okay, this ID is auto-generated, seeing we've already set this primary key to true. So basically we're telling this table that okay, for every data we add to this table, create an ID for that data and make sure it is unique, simply because the primary key is basically pointing to each row in our database. So basically it has to be different from every other one. You can't have two or more. You can't have more than one field or one row with the same primary key or with the same ID. So we're also telling our database that we'll be having, or this on this table, we'll be having a field or a column named username, and to only be accepting strings with a length of 20. And they were telling it that okay, this username has to be unique. So like no two people can have the same username. Basically, that's what we're telling this that's what this here does. Unique equals true. Then we are also creating a field for our password, where also a string, where we'd say okay, just this is where our password will be saved. Then so the three major information or data I'll be getting from each user to add to the database is the username, the password, and the email. Like I said earlier, the ID is automatically generated. It's generated itself. So basically, this is like the simplest way of creating a table using Python, using SQL Alchemy. Basically, so we'll still get to creating this table because we've only defined the table. We haven't created it yet. So to create a table now, what we need to do is now to go into our terminal or go into the environment of the application and then tell this database to go ahead with creation. That's why I deleted you see, if you guys remember clearly, there was a file here, temp.db. I'm sorry, test.db. That's the name of our database, but I deleted that. So this is showing that we don't have a database yet. We're just only telling that okay, we are going to create a database with this table. So now let's go ahead to create our database. To do that, I'll go into my terminal. Then okay, this is probably not beyond the scope, but this is not like one of the things I was going to teach, but let's see. So the best way to do this is to go into the terminal to our self session, and so we're in the same directory. I made sure this is ECX folder, ECX directory. I'm the same directory as this here. So I'm currently in this directory here. So what I'm doing is I've opened my Python shell session. Now I need to import this database into that sales session because we want to create our database here. So I need to bring this database from this file into that session. So I'm just going to do from main. Remember, I named my file main.py. So you can give your file any name, but just remember that name is what you're going to be using. So I'm
I'm going to name it main. I named the main py. So here we'll do from main import ed. But before we go ahead, this is a regular Python shell session. However, we're trying to create a database for this application, not just any random application, not just a regular database, just like a random database, a database specific to this particular application. And you know, to do that, Flask gives us this feature called context. We have to create a context for our application, basically. Say that, okay, because usually, let's even look at it from a general point of view, from like English. When some people say some things, you're like, in what context are you talking about? Because some things could mean A in a particular context and mean something entirely different in another context. So basically, we have to create a context in our shell session here, telling this shell session, sorry, that okay, we want to create this database in this particular context, in this particular application. So to do that, actually, what I did here, I was supposed to I would usually just import both of them at the same time, but I wanted to show you guys. So what would usually do is just do from main import app db. I can just import both of them on the same line. But since I already imported db here, there's no need to do this again. So we have to import our app. Now that we have our app in this shell session, we then tell this shell and the session that okay, we want to push this context. And the easier or the way to do that, the feature, the function Flask has given us to that is to do app.app context. Sorry, context dot push. So basically, what we are doing is we are pushing this app context into this shell session. We're telling this shell session that okay, the context we are working with is this particular application, not any other application. This one here. So if I click enter, now we know that okay, it doesn't return anything, but then as long as we don't get any error, we can be sure that okay, we are working in this particular context. So now I can then decide to now do. Remember, here there's no database yet. Now I can now come here and do db.create all. And with this, our database has been created. It's as simple as that. And this database has been created with a table of with this table, basically. So what that does is we've created this context. So when we do db.create all, this db goes into this app context and finds everywhere or every point that db was called or used. So what we did is we said Sql Alchemy database URI is equal to this test.db. Then we equated Sql Alchemy to db. So basically, what it does is okay. Now that I'm the database or I'm the how I put it, like I'm the one holding or I'm like a variable connecting you to the database. I'm going to go into this context and see what is happening. So I'm going into the application context. Now the configurations for the application states that I'm supposed to create a database named test.db. So the first thing I'll do is to create that database. Now that I've created database, is there any other part of the app where I'm needed? So yes, another part is to create a table for that particular database. All of that is abstracted away from us. We don't see all of that happening, but it happens basically. That is one of the advantages of abstraction. You don't get to try and stress about the low level functionalities. Basically, what happens is everything is abstracted away and you just make use of what you need to do. So we can be sure now that this test.db already contains a table with this. I'd actually like to show us the table using one of these tools I use, but it's just going to take a while. So let's forget about that for now. So now we have our table. Let's go on to the next. I'm sure you guys also remember the idea of decorators. To define a route or to define an endpoint or define a resource, what we need to do first, to define a resource, what we need to do first is create a route for it. So this route is telling us that okay, when someone goes to this particular route, let's say our website is, let's assume our website is my website.com. So when someone goes to my website.com / like without anything, so that's the same thing as my website.com. It's a render index.html. I mentioned that before, so I'm sure we can remember. I'm just trying to like explain what each line does. So when they go to my website.com, it renders index.html. If we created another route, say app.route, let's say me, def me, return render template me.html. So if we now go to my website.com /me, it will go to me.html. But if we remove this me, it will go to index.html. So basically, the routes we define here is like everything that comes after our domain name. This is our domain name, mywebsite.com. Then everything or every endpoint or every resource that comes after that is what we are defining here. So if we want to do a lot, blah blah blah, whatever, whenever someone goes to this route here, so it will now be, so if someone wants to use this particular end resource, they would have to do this. You have to go to this particular web page to be able to make use of this resource. So I'm sure we are clear about that, right?
Yes, it's clear.
Okay, good. Okay, great. So simply now we've created a resource that leads us to the home page of the website. So simply this website simply just contains 4 pages: the home page, a page for you to register your account, a page for you to log in your account, and your dashboard after you log in. So simply now let's look at this register. Simply like I explained earlier. So to register, you just have to go to mywebsite.com /register. It's as simple as that. Now, this resource has 2 methods. Well, like we are already familiar with HTTP methods: get method to fetch data, post methods to submit or to send data back to the server, basically. So the get is to get the register page. The post is to actually now submit our data. So simply, we remember our forms now. So what this does, form is equals to register form. So basically, in this file, I've predefined a form called register form. Last week, excuse me. So these are the dependencies or the thing, or the extensions, the modules that are the features, basically, whatever we decide to call it, that our script, our file here is making use of. So we are using Flask form. We're using this field, different fields we want to use, and then our validator. This is to make sure that, as the name says, data required, to make sure that they don't leave the field empty. So we've defined a register form, and the register form has 4 fields, basically. A field for username, which is a string field, a field for password, which is also a password, which is a password field, and a field for you to input your, because usually now when you register, you have to input your password twice, things like that. So a field for you to input your password again, which is also a password field, then a field to input your email, which is a string field, and then a field for you to submit. So simply, we've just created a form, or we've instantiated it. We've created the form instance here, but the form still is not on our website yet until here we now call the form. We say, okay, form equals to register form. So we'd say we've imported the form here in this new file from forms import register form. So we're saying, the form I defined earlier, I want to make use of that form now. So now
in public.
Sorry?
In public. Of course, now. If you scoop every game, but at least not leave junks scattered everywhere.
Wait, what's up? Why is this expanding now? Okay, sorry about that. So back to what we're doing. So basically, a simple way to do, okay, if now this request is basically just as it says, request are HTTP request. So it's getting it's trying to see that, okay, what method did you use to make the request? Are you trying to get a file? Are you trying to get data? Or are you trying to submit data? So if the method you are using is a post, if the request you are trying to make is a post request, simply if you are trying to, mostly post requests are used when you like fill a form, like I mentioned. There are other uses for it, but then that's like the most common or general use. So if it's a post request, do this and things, blah blah blah. But if not, just return this page. So basically, if it's not a post request, it can only be a get request. I mean, people could usually try and change. If it was like an API, they could actually change it like a post request or a patch request, whatever it is. But then if it was an API, it will actually raise an error here. But we'll get to APIs, I think, in coming weeks. But for now, we've already defined this method, and saying we are building a web app that has a front end, the only request that can happen here, if it's not a post request, is simply a get request. So we don't have to like check if it's a get, as long as it's not a post request, then we know it's already a get request. So all we do is just return render templates, register the HTML. Basically, we are returning this web page to them, this HTML file to them, that okay, this page, this is what we want you to see, and this form that we defined here earlier is the form we want you to fill. So basically, I'll still show you guys, or I think, okay, maybe I should just show you guys now, the register page. If you guys can remember clearly, I talked about Ginger, the Ginger 2 engine, the Ginger templating system. I also talked about what's it called, variables. So basically, we pass this variable, this form, we pass this to the front end, to the template here, saying okay, whatever form, this is the form we want to use in the register.html. Remember, we defined the form here. So now in this register.html, there are some things we have to import, or we have to bring in to be able to make use of that form. Number one is this bootstrap. This bootstrap is simply just to help us beautify the page. Though at the end of the day, I didn't really put much styles. I didn't even put any styles at all. So the page is just plain. But then it's just for us to understand. I mean, I'm a backend. We are learning Flask as backend engineers. So basically, at the end of the day, we'll mostly end up writing more APIs than web apps. But if you're going to be learning web apps, then it's as simple as just adding your own styles, your own we are familiar with HTML, so we already know how to add CSS to our file. So I didn't add any to this, so we'd see it when I run the server. But simply Bootstrap helps us to beautify our page. Then also we have this WTF, which is what we are going to use to render our form. So remember here in our forms, we imported WTF forms. Basically, it's just, that's what we are simply doing here. So this WTF helps us to render our forms. So to move forward, this is a block for our styles. We could actually add other styles here. You guys remember how blocks work now. So basically, you can add styles here. So this super here, what it does is to tell this thing that, okay, first of all, before you use any other style, make sure that what we've imported, you are leveraging that style first. It's the same way we work with Python. So basically, when you are defining a class and then you're inheriting from another class, and let's say you're defining a constructor for that class, you can say, okay, well, first do the, how will I put it? First do the constructor for the class we are inheriting from, do the features or the task or the logic that was defined there first, before you then continue with the logic that I'm going to define. So basically, it's like saying use the style for the bootstrap we imported first, then now use whatever style we define here. Like I said, I didn't define any style, but if you decide to, you can define a style here for whatever. So then we end our block. Always remember to end your block, basically, in Ginger templating system. Then we are defining a block for our content. Simply, our content just contains two major things. This part, which is a message. So I'll still take you guys through this code, this logic here. But basically, you can see here that I'm sending some messages to the front end. And now, ideally, there is a better way of sending messages like this to the front end using Flash. Can just flash messages basically, but I didn't want to stress, I didn't want to stress myself that much. So all I did was just to do this. This is actually quite easy. But then as we go deeper into Flask, and if we're going to be working on web apps, we'll be using that Flash a lot to like just flash messages basically. So what I'm doing is, if there's a message from the backend, print out the message in a paragraph. If there's no message, nothing goes up. So this line only runs, or this block of code only runs if there's a message. Now with that done, this line here is to instantiate a div. We're like I said, we're familiar with HTML. We already know what div is. Now, these classes here that are defined here are all Bootstrap classes, predefined by Bootstrap. So when I was explaining to us that Bootstrap helps us to beautify our code, our web pages, this here. So basically, we're telling this now, okay, this column should take, when we are on a medium screen size, should take 10 out of 12. So basically, the way Bootstrap works is it divides your screen into like 12 bits. So you are saying here that, okay, on a medium screen, use 10 out of 12. On a large screen, use 8 out of 12. Blah blah blah, things like that. This one is telling that on a large screen, automatically decide on or detect the best possible feature or the best possible sizing to use, basically. And then remember, we imported our WTF here, so we are going to use that WTF to render the form that we sent the front end here. So it's going to tell. So basically, what it's doing is that, okay, this form that I sent to you to register the HTML, render it for us here. Simply. So if we run our server, did I change anything? I want to be sure I didn't change anything major. Okay, if we run our server and we went to our register endpoint, well, let me show you the index page first. As simple as that. The index page is like we already know, like just a simple HTML page that tells you welcome stranger, and then it gives you links to your register page and to the login page. Now we remember I mentioned URL4. URL, basically what URL4 does is take a function, if a predefined function that already has a route. So it takes register, builds a URL for this function based on the routes we defined above the function. So basically, we are simply passing a link here. Okay, we're simply passing a link here saying, okay, the link to register is the URL that this URL file is going to build based on this register function. Same thing for this login. So okay, let's just look at how it is first before we move on with the logic. So if I went to my terminal now and I say Python main.py, so simply, okay, well, yeah, these errors, don't just mind this one. These are just like suggestions from pip. So simply, our server is running now. Now let's go to this this link, this page, basically. So usually when you deploy your website to an actual server, you do all your settings and then you have like, say, mywebsite.com. So this here we are going to use like a replica of mywebsite.com, but it's only that this is in our local server. So this is a local host on port 5000, basically. So let's do control. Okay, let's just do this. 127.0.1 start /5000. So as you can see here, like we defined in our script or in our file, all it's just going to do is welcome stranger, then gives us links to the register and the login page. Remember, all we did here is just to render templates, and it already gives us all this functionality. This URL already builds the URL for us here. So basically, we have a page that says welcome stranger, the home page, and then we have two links to either register or login. Like I said, I didn't add any CSS to it, so that's why it looks this plain. But then the point is to just make you guys understand the features and how it works, the internal workings, basically. So let's say I click on register now. Okay. Now there's an issue. I did not have that issue before. Oh, okay. I guess it's this. Let me just return this back to the way it was. Not it's key. So let's see. I'd usually like to close, clear, and restart my server. So with this, you can then go to our register page. So as you guys remembered, in our forms we defined 4 fields or 5 fields, but 4 simple input fields that takes in a username, a password again, and then the email. And in our register form, we didn't have to stress about doing creating a form, doing this form. Then we can now do form action, blah blah blah, whatever it is we want to do. Then I start doing inputs and all that. We didn't have to go through all of that stress. Simply, we've created our form here. So all we have to do is just render the form here. This line, this simple one line is what is giving us all the fields we have here. So simply, it makes things easy for us. So all we have to do is just now come here and try and beautify the form however we want. You can add your CSS style here, but I won't be doing that for now. So basically, we've defined our form here that takes in a username, a password, the password again, an email address, and then you can submit. So before I go ahead to fill this, let me walk you through the logic of the registration process. So basically, what the registration process does is simply, now, like I was going to say, filling a form here is automatically a post request. I mean, if we were to define the form ourselves here by using the form syntax sheet like that, we would have to define a method equals post. Yeah, but then the fact that we are using this WT form already gives us that, so we don't have to go through. It abstracts a lot of things. That's one of the important, or one of the usefulness of dependencies of extensions. Basically, they just abstract a lot of low-level features for us, and they just give us the functionalities we need. So all you have to do is just make use of it and not stress yourself. Except it's now giving you issues. Sometimes I face things like that where a feature or an extension I was using was giving me issues, then I have to implement the feature myself. But apart from that, one thing I used to say is every programmer should be lazy. So you should like find the easiest, not like the easiest, but then at the same time, I'll say the easiest but efficient, the easiest and the most efficient way out of something without having to do much work, do much of writing code. Because the more code you write, the more possibilities of your code base breaking down due to bugs, basically. So we have a simple line that does all of this for us, and we have our form here simply. So the logic basically is, if once a user fills this form and clicks submit, the form tries to validate itself using all these validators that we defined here. Simply, we've just defined a simple validation, data required. There are a lot of other validators you could use, but then we won't be stressing ourselves more on this. I feel if you need more, you can just do some research while software developers. This is one of the things we should learn. We should learn how to learn. So we should learn how to like go online, go out there and then like research, find out, ask questions basically. So there are a lot more other validators you could use, but we'll just stick to this one now. So basically what it does is, once a user fills the form and submits, it will check if the submission or if the form is valid, defined here. So if the form is valid, it then goes ahead to carry out the logic we defined here. Why is this doing this now? Sorry. So basically, this is the logic we defined. Simple, yeah. So what I'll be explaining what each line does. So basically, it's simple. The username just take from the form, take the username field and get the data that is in that field. So basically, whatever the person fills in here, fetch it. Simple, and assign it to the variable username. The same thing for email, the same thing for password, the same thing for repeat password. So now we have all the data that was filled here, we have it here. Simple. So now moving on from this, we do a few checks. Usually there are a lot more checks I'll do when I'm building a web app. I'll do schema checks, I'll do a lot of other checks, but then I just made it simple. So basically, the first check we're doing here is make sure the password this person puts here is the same as the password they put again. So you see, we put your password, you put password again, repeat password. So make sure both passwords are equal. Make sure both passwords are the same. Basically, that's the check we're doing here. So we're saying if this password 1 is not equals to this password 2, render this template with this form, and this pass this message that says passwords do not match. Now remember, like I said earlier, there's another way to do this, doing flash passwords do not match. You can do this, but then we'd have to go to the front end here and also write some few things for us to be able to see the message. But I don't want to stress myself. I'm just going to take it off because ideally we're going to be building more APIs than web apps as backend engineers. So in that scenario, we won't be needing this flash feature at all. for APIs. If you are building a web app, then you would actually be making use of that. But like I said, as backend engineers, we'll be ideally we'll be building more APIs than web apps. So basically, that's why I didn't stress about it. So now, so basically, what this does is if this password is not equal to this password, right? Password is normal. So let's test this out before we move on to the next. Okay, or let me just explain everything first, then we'll try it. So now what this does, this user, now you guys remember me talking about ORMs, object relational mappers, or models, basically that abstracts the writing raw SQL away from us. So this is it in action now. We defined a model or a table named users earlier. Okay, so now we are trying to query that table. We're trying to fetch information from that table. Usually, when we want to write this in raw SQL, what we'll do is select from users where username equals username. I think this is like the basic SQL syntax that would usually have to write to get this, but then it wouldn't be how will I put it? Yeah, it might still look quite simple since it's just one line, but then at the same time, this particular line is even really bad. Because if I was writing raw SQL and I wrote this, more it's be bad because this gives room for SQL injection. If I'm going to do something like this, I'll probably just do something like what's this thing? Sorry, let's see. S, and then I'll probably do something like let's, then username. I'll not put the raw the data we're trying to find inside the raw SQL. But then when we now start getting to the more complex parts, writing raw SQL, which is something you should learn, but it might actually start getting messy. So that is where this object relational mapper comes in. So basically what this does is it queries the user's database based on it filters it by this username. So go to the user's database and get the first field that passes this field where username equals to the username that was input here. So basically what we're doing is we're trying to check if there's a field or there's a row in the database that has this username. Now remember, we're trying to register here. So basically we're trying to see if someone else has already used this username or this name as their username. So if it successfully finds a field with this particular username, you have to go back to the front end and tell them, okay, sorry, someone has already made use of this particular username. So basically, username has already been used. So that's simply what we're trying to do here. We could do a lot of other checks. We could do schema checks. We could do what else? Okay, schema checks does a lot of validation checks for us. But I'd usually do if you're like dealing with like full this now, I say check the email address to see if it's like an actual email address and not just some random text and things like that, basically. So with that, when we've done all our checks and we say okay, every check passes, what we want to do next is to now add the data to the database. So, but now, like I mentioned earlier, we can't just add we can't just put our password in plain text. That's like a very huge security risk. So what we need to do is to generate a password hash for our password. Now, I mentioned this earlier. This library or this module already gives us that function, generates password hash. So basically, what we are doing is generate a password for us based on our secret key and whatever password we send to it. So now we already have our password hash. Then we can now add the data into the database. Like I said earlier, this is Python syntax based on the Flask Sql Alchemy ORM. Usually, like some of us may already know, if we were to add to a database, what we usually do is something like create blah blah blah, create create a field on this table, and then we pass the data we want to pass. But then this ORM abstracts everything away from us. So all we just simply do is just user equals users, then username equals to like this is, then database dot this particular session does add. So we're adding this user to the database, then we are making a commit. If you don't do this, simply you just created an instance of this user. You've not added it to the database yet. So you have to make sure after creating the instance, you add that instance to the database and you commit it. So with this line here, we would have successfully added this user that just registered to the database. Once we've added, what we want to do now is just, okay, now we've registered, now we are going to log in. So we want to redirect the user to the login page. And remember, URL for builds a URL based on the function we pass it, and the function here, login function, it would create a URL for it. So simply after registration, it links you directly to the login page. So I think I should just like explain the old code base first before we now go and see. So now that this what's it called? Okay, let's do this register first. Sorry. So we already understand how the logic of this register function works. Now let's see it in action. So say I went to this web app. Okay, now welcome stranger, blah blah blah. Now I went on Facebook. Facebook tells me welcome stranger. Okay, now I want to register. I want to create an account with Facebook. So I click on register. Now clicking on register, it takes me to this page where I have to input my details. Now this, sorry, are we guys following? I'm sorry, are we following? Hello guys.
Yes, we can hear you. I can hear you.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah, we
following.
can.
So any issue or any question so far? You guys understand everything I'm saying so far, right?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, we're following.
Okay, great. So now simply we've gone through the logic. So now let's see it in action. So say I now went to facebook.com, I click on register. I have to input my username. So let's say I want to give myself username of Damilare. Now I want to give myself a password of 12345. Now let's test out the edge cases. This is one thing you should endeavor to do when you're building your apps. Test out edge cases. Now the password I put in here is 12345. Now let me put 1234. Then let me put an email address a@b.c. Simple. So remember, this password here and this password are not the same. So this is not supposed to work. Now let's try it out. Great. It says password do not match. Pardon my spelling here, but you get the idea. So simply, what this does is to say the password you input here and the password you input here do not match. And that's what this part here is doing. If password is not equal to password, return this and say passwords do not match. match. Sorry. So yeah, simple. So simply that works. Now let's go back to this and say, okay, let's actually now input actual matching passwords. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So now we successfully created an account, and as you can see, it redirected us directly to the login page immediately. So we used an email, we used a username that has not been used before. So this didn't raise an error. This part here did not raise an error. Then let's say we are done with all our checks. It's created a hash for my password, added me to the database, and then redirected me to the login page. As you can see, so everything here works. The logic of the code has proved itself here. So now let's go back to the register page. Now let's assume true. Now let's assume now, okay, I now want to create a new account. And I say I'm now still going to use that same Damilare as my username. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now two people can use the same password. It doesn't matter. Their password hash is going to be different. That's one thing you should keep in mind. 100 people can use the same password, but then when it's hashing the password, it's going to hash it different from every other person, from everybody easily. So just understand that. So I'm just going to be using 12345 again, so that I don't forget the password that I use. And then let's say email. Let's say b@c.d. Submit. Now this is telling us username has already been used, simply because the account I created earlier, I used the same username Damilare. So this is just for us to see that, okay, all these checks that I did here is not just for decoration, it's for a reason. You have to make sure you're checking some things to make sure that, okay, because there are edge cases, can say, okay, someone can come and say I want to create an account. Like imagine you going on Instagram, on Twitter now, and then searching for Damilare, you're seeing like 4-5 people with it's not even possible. You can see 4-5 people with the same display name. That's different. But then you can't see more than one person with everybody has a unique username. Simply. So this here is doing that check for us. It's telling us that okay, if there's someone with the username you're trying to use, tell you, like we are used to it now, trying to register on an account on a website and then telling us that okay, sorry, your username has been used. So that's what this one does. So basically, we already see that in action. So if I decide to use another username, say dummy, just dummy now this time, and I do 1 2 3 4 5. 1 2 3 4 5. Now this is gonna work. Simple. So we understand the register endpoint now. And now let's go to the login endpoint. So the login endpoint is almost like this register endpoint. So simply we've predefined our form here. After predefining the form, we instantiate the form. If it's a get request, if I just try to get the login page, render login.html with this form. But if we are already on the login page and then we now click on submit, we want to submit a form, that'll be a post request. So simply like before, the form will try to. Okay, sorry, there's an issue here. I see that now. So excuse me. So the form would try to validate itself based on the validators we defined here. As soon as the form has been validated, we get the data from form dot what did I do here? The password dot data. So basically we have the username and the password here. Then simply what we do now is now check if a user with this username exists. We've already seen this line before. Basically, it goes to the user's table, it queries the user's table and filters it by this username. So it checks if there's a user on this table that has this particular username, and it assigns that user to this variable user. So now we're checking if not user means if this user equals to none. That means if you didn't find any user with this particular username, return this and say user not found. Simply. So if I've registered 2 accounts now, one with Damilare and one with Dami. So if I now go to login and instead of typing Damilare or Dami, I now type Olua Damilare, it's going to tell me user not found. Simply. Then now, after we've successfully found our user, okay, there's a user with this username. The next thing to do is to check if the password I entered when I'm trying to log in is the same as the password that has been saved to the database. Now, there's a way Python there's a way Flask does that for us. It already gives us a feature called check password hash. What we simply do is to pass check password hash to pass the password that was imputed and then the password that was saved in database to this function, and it will confirm for us if those passwords are the same. So I was trying to do that because I just wrote this code today about a few hours ago, and I was trying to do that, but it was giving me some errors. So that's why I just did this miniature fix. But now let me try it again, Sha. Since I think I see where the error was coming from now. So if we do no. Okay, so this is also part of it. So if we do if not check password user the so let's here we go. Message equals password. All right. So simply what we are telling this guy to do is now check based on we've already gotten a user with this username. Now check if the password that is saved to that user is equal to the password that was entered in the login form. Now, if not check password, that means if this returns a false, like this returns a boolean basically. If the password here is equal to this password, it will return true. If not, it will return false. So what we are saying here is okay, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this kind of writing. We can easily just do if check password hash user dot password equals false. We can do this. say if this one equals to false. But then usually this line here, the first line on top is more Pythonic than this. So it's best to get ourselves familiar with proper Python syntax. So we say if not check password hash. So that means if this password is not equal to this password, return, go back to this login page and give them a message that okay, password is incorrect, basically. So now if the password is equal, like if that means the password equal, that means now let's log in the user. So usually to log in users, personally, I don't use sessions. I use, when I'm building web apps, I use Flask login, and when I'm building APIs, I use JWT. And we'll get to JWT in a few weeks, like as we go on in this class. But then to easily just understand sessions, session is like a storehouse where we can save data specific to this particular session. What we mean session is when you go to a website, you go to facebook.com, and then you know when you use like a while, like okay, don't let use Facebook. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Kuda now, for instance. Not the mobile app now, the web platform. If you go on Kuda, the web platform, and you log in, if you don't do anything, if you're inactive on the platform for about 5 minutes, it automatically logs you out. Basically, so that 5 minutes that you have before it logs you out automatically is your session. So you have a session like your time or your space, time, space, complexity, everything. Let's just bring all of that into it. Your time and space, your everything you are doing on that website specific to you is your session on that website or that web app. So basically what we are doing here is to add your username to this session. So basically we are saying, okay, if we've successfully validated or authenticated this user, add that user to the session. So anytime we now need to make use of this user, we can simply just, instead of having to now go and query the database again, we can simply just go to the session and get the user. So the session is like a dictionary. Let's look at it that way. A dictionary with a key of user. So now, simple. So let's just look at it that way. Simply you add the user's the username to the session and then you redirect to the dashboard. Now, in this dashboard, we are going to make use of this user that we added to the session. So that I just made it as simple as possible. When we go to this dashboard, all it does is it gets, so this line, what this line is doing is go to the session and get a value for the key user. Remember, the key we used was user and the value is the username. So basically, we are saying this username, or let's just name this username. Or no, let's just leave it at user. Okay, username. This username equals whatever is stored in the session under user. So once we have our username, we now want to pass that username to our front end to make use of it. So basically now let's see this. We've seen the register endpoints in action. Now let's see the login and the dash. So now that I've registered, okay, I'll show you okay, I want to even test this check password hash first, sidetrack. So let's see. Control C there. Okay, great. So let's say let me use a random username that I've not saved up before. So let's say blank god, and then I input my password 12345. It's gonna come back and tell me user not found, simply because I haven't registered a user under the username blank god. And this is where that happens. Simple. If you try to check the database for a user named blank god, if it finds that username, to move ahead. But if not, like that. So if I find the username, good. If not, do this. Render this template with this form and tell the message user not found. And that is simply what we have here. So let's move on to the next. Now let's go to a user that actually exists. So let's say Larry. Then now let's input a password. Our password that we used before was 12345. Now let's use, instead of 12345, let's use 54321. What is it going to tell us? Password is incorrect. Simply what happens is this check. Okay, so I think this is no longer needed, seeing I've found the actual fix to the issue I was facing before. So what this does is it simply checks, okay, now there's a user named Damilare. Go to the database and find that user. Good, I have the user here. So now the password attached to that user, is it the same as the password that this current user just entered? I entered 54321.
and the password in the database, like remember, is 12345. So it's going to tell me that okay, no, they are not equal. It's going to return false. So once this sees that okay, it returns false, what it to do is render this template with this form and say password is incorrect. Simple. So I'm putting an incorrect password again, and it will give us password is incorrect. So now if I now put in the actual password 12345, what it does is once, and you guys, I'm sure you guys also remember in Python, after a return statement, nothing else can run after it unless the return statement doesn't run. So if this block of code should run, then we can be sure that this part is not going to run. But as long as this block of code doesn't run, that means this is going to run. So basically, if this check doesn't pull through, that means if it checks the password and it sees that the password are equal, the block of code will not run. So it's to move on to the next line, which is to add the user to the session. Then after adding the user to the session, it redirects us to the dashboard simply. So redirect us to this resource over here. So now let's log in with the appropriate credentials, and we'll see how it will redirect us to the dashboard. Now, before we get to the dashboard, I want to remind us of something. In the index page, what we had was welcome stranger, simply because the user was not logged in yet. So we just add a general message that welcomes anybody. Whoever comes into the website is a stranger. But now that you've logged in, it's not give you a specific what was it called? A specific message. It's tell you directly, welcome Damilare. So this is what we are doing here. You see, we've passed the user as a variable to the front end, to this template here. So this is where we're now making use of that variable. So it's going to say welcome, then whatever user is logged in here. So now let's see that in action. So let's assume we log in here now with the correct credentials. It's not going to tell us welcome Damilare. So if I decide to go and create another account now, say let me use Clinton, password 12345 12345 12345, email c@b.e. So it's work. Clinton is already logged in. It's already registered. Now Clinton has to log in. Wait, what am I doing? Sorry. And then the password 12345. Now we'd see welcome Clinton. So basically, this simple code base, or this simple script we have here has covered the topics we've been dealing with for the past 3 weeks. We've dealt with basic introduction to Flask, creating our Flask instance. That's what we have here. We've also dealt with templates, as what we have here, templates in variables in our templates, conditional statements, if expressions, things like this, rendering variables, creating blocks, importing and inheritance and things like that. That was what we dealt with in the first week. And then in the second week, we talked about databases and ORMs, connecting to your database with Flask, creating tables, or creating a model or a table with Flask. That's what we dealt with in week 2. And then in week 3, that was last week, what we majorly dealt with was authentication and authorization. So Flask session, so adding your users to a session in Flask, authenticating and authorizing your users. So basically, we've not really touched authorization because that actually has to do with permissions more, but at least we've been able to touch authentication. Authentication is basically just making sure your user is allowed, or this particular user is allowed to is logged in, or is basically the English is authenticated. It's authenticated on your web app. That's as simple as it gets. So we've dealt with all of that. Now for the next topic, I think I'm going to hand over to Paul. Or does anyone have any question based on all of this?
No questions.
Okay, so you understand everything so far.
Yeah, you were quite clear with the explanation.
Okay, great. That's great.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
Okay, that's great. So sorry. Okay, I think that was just background then. So that's great then. Seeing with this, we've been able to treat the topics we were supposed to address or we addressed in the last 3 weeks. So this being the fourth week, we'll be talking a little bit about um blueprints and all that. So I think I'd hand over to Paul now. Though actually time might have gone because it's almost 7. But maybe he can just briefly introduce. I don't know what he has in mind. So Paul. Uh, okay. I don't know. Maybe he's like occupied with something right now. So yeah. So the curriculum. I think you guys have access to the curriculum now. Do we have access to the curriculum?
I've not seen the person.
Okay. So it's quite simple. It's right here. So we're supposed to be talking about Flask blueprints and building scalable web applications today, but saying I think that was supposed to be Paul, but saying is not is quite preoccupied, and I've actually taken most of the time. I guess we'll just merge it with next week's class. So I think it's more even it's like easier for us to pick things when there's like code example, like something like this than say me now trying to explain it from scratch and all that. So I guess for the coming classes, I'm just going to keep up with this, write out the code example for us to like see and then just explain what it does. So next week we'll be dealing with blueprints, dealing with scalable applications, and then we would get into building APIs proper. Because for now we're just building web apps. So we'll get into building web apps is basically you doing the front end and the back end together. So we'll get into building APIs. So we're just building back end, and they'll build like a gateway, an API for people to consume that back end, and then we'd have some front end guys to come and consume our front end for us. Though in this class, we'll just be testing with Postman. We'll probably do a little bit of documentations too. But then in the real world sense, ideally, what happens is actually you build your application, you test with Postman, you document, then you deploy, then the front end guy comes to consume your API. So basically, you build an API for like a e-commerce platform. Then the front end guy comes, builds the user interface, then connects to your API, connects to your backend, and consumes and makes use of the logic you've written. So we'll be dealing with that and more in the coming weeks. We'll touch JWT authentication. Would probably just take a little bit look at third-party authentication and things like that. So basically, I think with this we've covered, at least we've covered because with everything that we've learned so far, you can actually build if you are good with HTML with front end, like you know how to style web pages very well. You can actually build a proper web app. It might not be so secure, but with everything you've learned in this class and on rendering templates, you can just simply just go to this page, add everything you need to add, style it, go to your login page, add the things you need to add, style it, and you have a full web app, as the case may be. Though in the real sense, there's still like a few more things to add, but then if you are being real ourselves, you have everything you need in your arsenal to build a proper web app right now. So thank you guys for joining this class today. It was great. It was great having you here. I mean, at first I was feeling a little bit disappointed because for like the first 10-15 minutes I was the only one on the call. But it's not about numbers, it's about the quality of the class. So thank you guys for being here. I hope you've learned a few things, and I hope to see more of you on the Slack channel and then also next week class. All right, so if there's no question or anything, I would probably just end the call now. If you have a question, you can raise it. If not, you can just say your goodbyes and would end it for today.
So there are no questions. No questions.
No questions here either.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, no questions. Thank you very much. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, no, yeah. So I would see each other next week. I mean, we'll talk more next week. Man. So have a wonderful weekend ahead and cheers.
Then you too. Bye.